Hello, and welcome to Leader Folk. I'm your host, Sara, and I have a quick disclaimer for this week's episode. My guest, Dana Levinson Steiner, and I recorded this on May 22nd. That was 3 days before George Floyd was killed, and before the subsequent renewal of energy and fervor behind the Black Lives Matter movement. I wanted to make sure that you had that context so that you understand why we don't delve into these subjects that have been top of mind for most of us over the past month. Thank you so much for being here, and please enjoy this week's episode of Leader Folk. Hello, and welcome to Leader Folk, an inclusive look inside the Jewish community. I'm your host, Sara, and today I am so pleased to welcome Dana Levinson Steiner. Dana is the director of Access Global at AJC, where she oversees an international program to engage young professionals through transformative leadership development, and she's the founder of Chutzpanit, From Campus to the C-Suite, a preparatory and mentorship program for Jewish college women that aims to close the workplace and leadership gender gap. Dana, you are exactly the kind of person that we want to talk to on this podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be here.
So I'd love to start just by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your Jewish journey and how that brought you to where you are today.
Amazing. I love the Jewish journey question because, I guess it's like the Robert Frost poem where the road less taken. I think that really speaks to my Jewish journey. So just sort of to give a little bit of background. So I was born and raised in New Jersey, the beautiful Garden State. And I grew up in a really warm and loving, culturally Jewish family that was really engaged in the concept of Jewish community. So my mother was and still is really devoted to the Jewish Federation system. She was involved from the time she was my age, which is in my mid-30s, with the Federation. And when I was a child, I didn't realize that her full-time job was not going to Federation meetings. I just thought that was what she did for a living. And it turns out that she is an accomplished professional in her own right. But my understanding of the time that she gave back to the Jewish community was so profound that I honestly thought it was her entire profession. So that gives a little bit of insight sort of into how I was raised, which was that the Jewish community is so essential, and supporting and nurturing the Jewish community and really being a leader in the Jewish community was really important. So I really learned that from an early age from my family. And when I was in high school, I happened to get involved with USY. It was certainly not something that I think my childhood synagogue educators would have believed to be true, but ultimately it was where I sort of found my people, so to speak. I absolutely fell in love with Judaism because it was the first time that I really felt that I could do Judaism on my own terms and that it was impactful, it meant something to me, and that I was surrounded by other people who were feeling that kind of connection as well. So it was through USY that I became super engaged with Jewish life as a teenager. It was through USY. I went on USY on Wheels. I went to Poland and Israel on their pilgrimage experience. And ultimately, that was what led me to Camp Ramah. So I actually never went to Ramah as a camper. I went elsewhere, and it's one of my deepest regrets as an adult that I did not go as a camper. But I think I'm one of the many who felt their lives become transformed by the experience of being at a Ramah camp. And it was really at Ramah that I honed and refined my leadership. It's where I fell in love with Israel and with Israelis. And really where I found my voice as a feminist, egalitarian woman. It really happened at Ramah. And I think it's those formative experiences, which sort of are like those stacking, babushka dolls, where in the smallest little doll was my childhood and my family, and then USY, and then Ramah, and then ultimately I would go on to study Jewish experiential education and become a Jewish communal professional. And that's sort of where I am now with this larger stacked doll, is I'm really so proud to be a part of the Jewish community as a professional, not only as a lay leader. And I serve, as you mentioned earlier, as the director of Access Global for AJC, which is our young professional network. We serve young professionals around the world between the ages of 22 and 40. And our objective is to not only, engage them in AJC's, mission critical work, which is combating anti-Semitism, advocating for Israel's place in the world, promoting democratic values. It's also to nurture that next generation leadership. And it feels very full circle in many ways, because I feel like what I was, taught as a child is now my job to do the same thing for what my mom experienced when she was my age. So it's a very full circle journey. But it's one that I've been so proud to be a part of, and one that has been really just exciting, to say the least.
So in addition to your work at AJC, you also founded Chutzpanit, and I'm curious, where were you on your journey at the point where you started this, and how did that kind of intersect with where you were on your personal and professional path to then start giving back to other women who needed that sort of guidance and mentorship?
It's such a great question. So prior to working at AJC, I spent 3 wonderful, formative, amazing years at the Bronfman Center for Jewish Student Life at NYU, which is their Hillel. And it was during that time I was exposed to some incredible thought leadership, ideology, experiences, and I was really inspired by many of my coworkers to explore opportunities and to create in a way that I really hadn't before in any other sort of professional setting prior to coming to AJC. And my then mentors and supervisors, Rabbi Yehuda Sarna and Rebecca Thornhill Tokatlalar, really encouraged me to think big about how to make my mark, not only in the center, but about how I can make an impact on the lives of our students beyond sort of the things that we do naturally as Hillel staff, whether that's, creating meaningful Jewish learning experiences or developing leadership or engaging them in Jewish practice. And something that had always been really important to me was, as I mentioned earlier, really developing a feminist and egalitarian identity. And the interesting piece about that is that even though I had grown up being told I could do what I wanted and I had no limitations in, aspiring for the stars, and I always had a pretty healthy self-confidence, which I hope doesn't sound conceited, but I always felt pretty confident in who I was, and I owe a lot of that to my family and to the situations I've been privileged to be a part of. But I often found myself in either work or leadership settings where I sort of would find myself not being 100% true to who I was. And what I mean by that is I didn't know my own worth and I didn't know my own value. And oftentimes I would find myself in situations where I would devalue myself or ask myself if I was really, as smart or as intellectual or as capable as I wanted to be or thought I could be. And I think probably the most salient memory that I have of this was, many, many years ago when I was starting in the field, I had received an offer from an organization I was really excited about, and I had received a salary, or I had been offered a salary that felt a little bit low. And, after consulting with my family, we sort of came to the consensus that, we would take the job because it was a job and it would hopefully open other doors for me. And ultimately what happened was that I realized 2 things, and this was about, 5 years later, but I realized 2 things. First is that I had no idea how to evaluate my own worth monetarily. I had no idea how to advocate for myself, or quite frankly, to even know that that salary range that they had offered was not acceptable given my level of work and academic experience. And also that I felt ashamed to ask other people if that was okay, if that was an appropriate salary range, if I should ask for more, if I could ask for more, because I think that there is a value and a stigma that's placed around women asking for more because there's concern that it will be taken away, that an offer will be rescinded, or that we should just be grateful for being offered the job at all, or for that matter, that we're just not worth more than what we've initially been offered. So it was in that moment of clarity that I was having numerous conversations with my students, and some of them were entering internships or were graduating and were having similar conversations. And I realized that there was this perfect nexus between Jewish learning and developing a kind of advocacy program, really, that focused on training these women women identified folks in college to have the proper skills that they needed. So when they entered the workforce, they wouldn't be behind in the way that I felt when I was already in my mid-20s, but that they would feel equipped to walk into the workplace and not only be able to advocate for themselves, but be able to advocate for other women. So that was really where the genesis of cultivate came from. And one of the exciting things about the program, now it's, almost 4 years later, we've had nearly 200 women go through the program, but it's really helped me walk the walk, and it's helped me give my friends and colleagues the confidence that they need and to amplify their accomplishments, to amplify their needs in a way that I certainly wouldn't have had the confidence to be able to do so before. So cultivate isn't only a program; it's really like a lifestyle and a mentality, and it's really like owning who we are. It's being women with chutzpah. So that's a little bit about that project. And while unfortunately it's not running at the moment because I've obviously changed positions, we're certainly looking to continue to explore it in some capacity, maybe reimagined or re-realized. But it's certainly something that holds a lot of value for myself and for NYU, as well as for the students who've gone through the program.
There are a couple things I want to highlight that you just said, beginning with very close to the beginning of your answer. You said something about being confident and hoping that it doesn't sound conceited. And I just love owning your confidence, and I so appreciate you saying it out loud, and I don't think it sounds conceited at all. And I also I also want to elevate this idea of teaching those students, those women, to bring each other up together, because I think that there is maybe an idea of once somebody has risen through the ranks, how can they send the elevator back down? And that there's some sort of individual achievement that's necessary to then think in this more community-minded way. And so I love what you said about teaching these women to rise up together and to help each other as they ascend.
Absolutely. And I think that's also such a Jewish value, is this concept of community, this concept of kahila, this concept of collective responsibility, that we are obligated to care for one another and to amplify one another's needs and voices. And I think that that's something which is, all the more relevant in our work when it comes to gender equity in the Jewish community. It's actually something I'm currently working on. I'm also a doctoral student at NYU. I'm hopefully going to be finishing sort of like phase one of my research, but my research actually focuses on Jewish organizational responses to lacks of gender equity, and how do we look at that from sort of a policy perspective, from an education perspective, from an organizational perspective. And there's just a tremendous amount of data that's currently out there, which indicates that, we can do so much better. We haven't necessarily found a magic bullet to identify exactly how we address this in a cohesive way. It's something that requires a lot of dismantling of systems. It requires a lot of things which will cause discomfort, hopefully productive discomfort, but discomfort. And it requires a tremendous amount of like rethinking. But it's something that I really hope to be a part of in my lifetime, in the lifetime of women who can hopefully enter the workforce feeling like they will be seen and heard and protected, and that they will not feel the way that many other women before them have felt, not only in the Jewish community, but, in the workforce generally.
So do you feel like you have encountered roadblocks that were specific to your gender in your work?
I would say some of those roadblocks were my own. And what I mean by that is when you internalize certain ideas about yourself, or when you internalize certain ideas about your value, or what you should or shouldn't ask for, or what you do or don't deserve, or what you are or are not worth, that prevents you from taking the risks or chances that can ultimately advance yourself professionally or personally. So there's a tremendous amount of data about how women are less likely to ask for raises, for example, and they are less likely to do so because they are concerned about the kind of reaction they'll receive, which, worst case scenario is no, and best case scenario is yes, but there's such a risk averseness to asking that oftentimes we just don't ask, and therefore we don't ultimately receive. So I think that some of the obstacles I've experienced in my career have been partially internalized, ones that I assumed would be challenges I couldn't overcome or things I couldn't, handle. And ultimately, once I found the voice and the confidence to be able to ask for it, ultimately it ended up working most of the time in my favor. I would also say, naturally, there are institutional challenges. There are institutional obstacles that exist. And I think oftentimes these are things that are implicit. Sometimes they're explicit, but oftentimes they're implicit, whether it's gender bias. There's a concept called second-generation gender bias. And what that means, to differentiate it from first-generation gender bias, is first-generation gender bias explicitly excludes women or others from certain spaces, all men's clubs, other experiences when women were not allowed to have seats on the board, things like that. Second generation gender bias is sort of the holdover from some of those things, in which we see things that are implicit that still exclude women from spaces, but aren't necessarily, they're not legalized. They're not things that explicitly prevent women from being able to participate. But, examples of this are, if you take a look at an event, when someone has completed an event and, there's a lot of food or there's a lot of setup or cleanup required, who are the people who are setting up and cleaning up? If you look around the room, you might want to ask yourself, is it women? Because there is an expectation that women typically are to be helpful and they should be cleaning up. Who are the people who are taking notes at meetings or making coffee or offering water when guests come? Those are the kinds of things that, again, it sort of pigeonholes women to perform certain roles that are generally anticipated or expected of them, but require an institution or organization to say, okay, you know what, like, sir, please, can you take notes, or can we arrange shifts so everyone is cleaning up, setting up, etc.? I would also say those are some of the minor things, but generally within the community, there are also significant challenges. We have seen women who have been excluded from conversations. We have seen women who have experienced tremendous amounts of abuse or harassment or exclusion or retaliation. And those are things that the Jewish community is not immune to. I would say personally in my career, I have been fortunate to not experience nearly as much abuse as other women who I work closely with in previous organizations or know quite well. And it's really a tragedy, I think, for our line of work, which so focuses on the values of our faith and of community, that oftentimes we hide behind other values like lashon hara as a way of saying we don't want to make accusations of poor behavior because it defiles who we are as a community. So sure, I would say, some of my obstacles I faced have either been what I would consider to be really inappropriate behavior from certain colleagues, who perhaps would speak in a way to me that they would not speak to male colleagues, or, frankly, instances in which my gender, my age, I haven't had this experience, but I know many who have chosen not to wear engagement rings to interviews, or to wear baggy clothing to hide pregnancies as a way of being afraid that they won't be able to get certain jobs. These are things that are not only exclusive to the Jewish community, of course, but these are real challenges that women face, and it is really important for us as a community and as a field to really address these issues in a serious way. Otherwise, we will never fulfill the kind of excellence that we know we can.
I'm thinking about your work with Access Global and developing a new generation of leaders. In this case, I believe it's open to any gender as opposed to Hutzpani, which was particularly for women.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, in your work with Access, are you able to address these issues in the leadership training that you are providing?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked that question. So we actually just completed a year-long transition for Access, where we invested a lot of time in looking at our systems, in looking at our leaders, in looking at our boards, and tried to determine where are the areas where we could not only improve, but the areas that we can celebrate and serve as a model for the rest of the Jewish community. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that we recently passed in January Access Global bylaws, which are really important. I think I'm a governance nerd, and I think that bylaws are really important because they set a standard for the kind of way in which you conduct your leaders and the standard you hold yourself to. And one of the clauses that we added to our bylaws is a diversity, equity, and inclusion clause. And basically, it reaffirms Access's commitment to ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we know we have a ways to go, but we are going to really devote resources and time to reaching new leaders, to elevating different kinds of leaders. And one of the areas that we've been really focused on that has been through gender. So I'm really pleased to share that as a result of passing that clause, that amendment, we also recently concluded our process of identifying our new board, and our nominating committee really took that into account in a really thoughtful way. So while we're not 100% perfect, I am pleased to share that our incoming board is going to be 55% male identified and 45% women identified. So there were other considerations naturally that we took into account. Gender isn't the only factor when we're putting together a board, but that is certainly something that we are proud of. We're so close to making that 5% 50-50. And it's something we really hope for our next coterie of leaders. But it's something that we've been cognizant of. It's something that we've been thinking critically about. And I think the most crucial piece is that our job is not to tokenize women. Our job is not to say we are adding women to this board because they're women and we need a woman. I hate when people say that. We need a woman. No, we need thoughtful, diverse leadership. And the statistics are overwhelming that when you add women to boards, when you add folks of color to boards, when you add individuals who maybe aren't the most philanthropically able, but bring unique social capital and networks, that is when we succeed. And I'm so excited to see where this board goes. But our objective in building a young leadership board is to nurture and support the development of the next generation of global Jewish advocates. And it's essential for the sustainability of access, but frankly, for the sustainability of AJC, who I'm delighted to share has the first female president in its now 114-year history, Harriet Schleifer, who is unbelievable. But that's really important that AJC and Access, by extension, model that women's voices and women's leadership matters. So that's something that I've really taken to heart, and I'm really proud that my fellow colleagues in Access, and frankly within the entire Young Leadership Department, the entire agency of AJC, are really, really supportive of that and feel really strongly that diverse leadership is what's needed to bring this 114-year-old organization to the next level and into the 21st century.
So on this podcast, we have a special place in our hearts for gender issues. It is meant to elevate and amplify the voices of female and non-binary Jewish leaders, but Jewish leadership is also a huge part of that mission. Mm-hmm. And I think that the work that you're doing to train and develop the next generations of leadership is so inspiring and so exciting. And I'm just wondering, what else is on your mind when you think about what the next generation of leaders needs in their toolkit or needs in their hearts to move organizations and our Jewish community forward?
That's such a great question. I think one of the things that I brought with me when I came to AJC was this idea of investment. That for far too long, young people have sort of felt like they're going through a revolving door of Jewish communal life. And far too often that the model is based on like a what's it called, pay to play kind of model. And while there is zero doubt, and actually it's something we worked very hard on within Access, is really creating a culture of giving, a culture of philanthropy, and putting it on the same level as our programming and our leadership, which was a big culture change, but a necessary one, that we didn't want the experience of our leaders to feel transactional, that they paid an admission price, they came to a program, they absorbed some sort of full frontal information, and then they went home. We really wanted to create a model by which our young leaders were not only invested in the work and the mission of AJC, but that they received very tangible opportunities that they could walk away saying, I can't get this anywhere else, and that I am completely 100% supported by this agency, that this is where my time, my treasure, and my talent is going to be spent. So one of the things that we have focused a lot on is creating really meaningful leadership development opportunities for our leaders. And it should be noted that Access has 15 chapters around the world. We have 11 in the United States, and then we have 4 globally. We have one in Brazil, we have one in Israel, we have one in Paris, and we have one in Berlin. So it's obviously reaching a number of young professionals at various stages in their lives. If you're between the ages of 22 and 40, that's 18 years of a lot of really big milestones that can happen in your life. You could find yourself getting married. You can find yourself having children. You can find yourself owning a home, changing jobs, being promoted, being let go. There are really so many things that happen in those formative years. And we wanted to really help create and chart a path for our young leaders where they felt engaged with us for not only those 18 years of which they're able to be involved with Access, but for the long run to continue their engagement and involvement with the AJC broadly once they've sort of graduated out of the young professional program. And as such, we have created a series of leadership development programs that really seek to nurture and develop them as leaders, that they not only understand in a deeper and richer way of what AJC does and why we do it and how we do it, but really looking at them as leaders and saying, what are you excited about? What do you care about? What is the most exciting quality that you want to bring to the table, which no one else can bring to the table? So I'll share, in January, which feels like 7,000 years ago, pre-pandemic, we hosted the first ever Access Global Leadership Institute in Atlanta, Georgia. And we hosted it in Atlanta because Access was actually founded in Atlanta just over 30 years ago. And it was from Atlanta that Access blossomed around the world. So we felt what better way to highlight this experience than to host the program where it all began. We brought together 30 young professionals from around the world. And I think it was from 7 different locations, including Israel, Brazil, and Berlin, which was really exceptional. And over those 2 days, we did really intensive advocacy training. We did development sessions. We did marketing and communication sessions. But I think one of the sessions which I was most excited about is I'm a real evangelist of Clifton Strengths Finders. I'm not sure if anyone else is familiar or has heard of it, but it's really the greatest thing in the entire world. And basically what it does is you take a test. It's a pretty significant test, and there are 34 different strengths that you can receive in descending order. So it's not so much that your 34th strength is a weakness. It's just not as strong as your top 5 strengths. The top 5 strengths that you have are not movable. It's whatever is first, and whatever is second. And I personally found that when I took this test and when I went through the motions and I found what my strengths were, I was like, wow, this is so amazing. This explains so much about who I am as a person and about who I am as a colleague and a friend and a wife and a worker. And we had all of our lay leaders take this test as well. And we did a whole session focused not only on their own strengths, but we actually compared their strengths to others in the room. And we found that this was essential when we're putting together boards or when we're putting together leadership cohorts, because it's so critical to understand where your strengths are, but also to understand perhaps where you're not as strong and who else in the room can fulfill those areas, which again talks about diverse leadership. So it's in these kinds of opportunities that we're really looking to invest in the whole person. We're not only looking for someone's dollars. We're not only looking for people to fill the room. We're not only looking for people who are going to stick with us from the time that they're 22 until they're 40. We are really making that investment in our young leaders, quite frankly, from the time when they are in high school with the AJC Lift program, our Leaders for Tomorrow program, all the way through their 80s and 90s and hopefully 100s. We have some AJC board members in Sarasota, Florida who are 100 years old. We hope that our Access leaders are soon going to be part of that exclusive club. But really, that is what diverse leadership is all about. It's about looking at the different pieces of who you are, nurturing, developing, strengthening them, and then sort of really carrying you along that leadership journey from the time, you begin with us until you graduate out through the rest of the organization. And I'm reminded by a really great piece of text, and it's actually technically related to Sukkot, where they're discussing the idea of a tree, of a palm tree, how it has all these different functions, the bark, the leaves, the fruit, and each of these things is really, really important individually, and together they form this beautiful tree. And I think that really speaks to what we're talking about with our leaders is that, okay, one person's bringing the fruit and one person's bringing the fronds and one person's bringing the bark. And those things are an essential part of making up the greater whole. But ultimately, we really want to look at the big picture. So by investing in the individual talents of our leadership, we ultimately create a stronger organization. And I think it's that kind of big picture thinking, really looking at diverse leadership, that will ultimately bring our organization and Jewish organizations generally into the next century.
I love that. And I love thinking about diversity in our leadership, not just based on gender or appearance, but based on what each individual is really able to bring to the table.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful.
Thank you.
Is there anything else in your work or your Judaism that I've skipped over that you were really hoping we would get to talk about today?
There's so many things. Judaism is great. Listen, I think that the Jewish community is experiencing a tremendous amount of uncertainty at this moment. I don't think I am being glib when I say this. We are amidst an enormous public health crisis, larger than what we've ever seen before. And the far-reaching impacts of this public health crisis that go beyond the physical safety and security of citizens around the world is also immediately being felt in our businesses, in our communities, in our spiritual and religious centers. And it's something that can feel very overwhelming and feel very scary. I think for many in the Jewish community, there is always the house of worship to fall back on. There's always the idea of the community, of the kahila. There's always the idea of the minyan, that you'll never have to be alone when you're going through a time of grief or going through a time of joy. And I think that notion of consistency is really broken at this time. We've seen people who haven't been able to have a minyan to say Shiva for someone, or not being able to gather for a bris, or it's had to be done through Zoom, which is amazing, but it's very different. And I think it's that kind of disturbance to what we know about community and what we know about our endurance of our Jewish institutions is very unsettling at this time. And I think it's been on a lot of people's minds, looking at really important Jewish institutions that serve the community in such an important way are not able to do so, at least not in the way that they were intended to do so. And that level of fear and anxiety is really permeating through the Jewish community right now. And I know it's on a lot of people's minds. But I think something that I've been personally inspired by, and something that I hope will be something we take from this experience well after we can look back on this as a moment in history, God willing, with health and security for all those who are affected. But there are a lot of things to learn from this, which is, what does the value of community look like when we can't be together? Which before was something we took for granted, and now is something that is a truth that we have now accepted. What do our priorities look like? Who are our audiences, and what are they looking for? And I think probably most importantly is, what does it look like when we either opt in or opt out of Jewish communal life? Because there is no easier time to opt out of Jewish life than right now, where you don't have to do anything. You don't have to participate in any virtual programming. You are not obligated to go to synagogue. You are not obligated to opt in to family time. You're not obligated to participate in Jewish ritual. These are all things that this pandemic has made way to negate from the daily parts of our lives. And I think now is the time where we can creatively think as a Jewish community, how do we encourage that opt-in attitude, given the reality of this pandemic and given the realities of what our Jewish communities are currently experiencing? And I think that something that we've been thinking a lot about at AJC, and I suspect many other organizations have been thinking similarly, is how do we create this kind of opt-in ethos that speaks to people, means something to people, and really is something that can't be ignored in this time. And while we haven't 100% come up with a solution, because I don't think anyone has come up with any sort of perfect solution for how we engage in spirituality and community and leadership in this time, I think something that we can be proud of and something that we can aspire to is to challenge ourselves to think creatively, and to challenge ourselves to free ourselves from the shackles of what we think is possible and really explore what can be possible. Technology has created so many channels for us. Our communities have gotten incredibly creative and thoughtful and compassionate when it comes to how we connect with one another. And I think that this is a really ripe time for the Jewish community to assess how we support one another and how we creatively overcome these challenges to inspire and to support an opt-in culture within Jewish communal life.
Totally. Yes, I think the whole time I was listening to you talk, I was like, we just need more creativity. And then you got there and I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I was right there, so ripe for that word.
Telepathy. Yes. Yes. I'm a big believer in creativity. And, I will say, I think it's two things that have really taught me how to adapt quickly. And I'm thinking a lot about this as I'm receiving email after email this week and Facebook notification after notification of all of the Jewish summer camps that are closing. And it just, breaks my heart in a million pieces. But it was really being at camp that taught me how to turn around programs on a dime. And if it starts raining, to suddenly move 120 campers into the gym and start doing Jeopardy with them very quickly. It's really Jewish summer camp that gives you all the tools you absolutely need to become the kind of leader and person that, is ideal. And really the second thing I would say is working in the Hillel space did something quite similar, which is turning things around really quickly, building consensus among emerging leaders and adults, asking yourself to think outside of the box of what we know is possible and what we think is possible. It was really working at the Hillel at NYU that changed my thinking radically about so many things, about identity, about leadership, about what community means, about what making space for people means, about what being part of, big tent Judaism means. And I think it's this sort of amalgamation of experiences that I've had as a Jewish communal professional and as a woman that have really inspired where I am now in my career, but also where I think the Jewish community has the potential to go. So naturally, I'm so grateful for all of the previous professional experiences that I've had and of the previous leadership experiences that I've had, which have just been so helpful in really guiding me as a person, but also the communities that I find myself a part of.
Thank you so much for being here, Dana, and for speaking so eloquently about Jewish leadership and about your work, developing new generations of leaders, lifting women up. I'm just A, so impressed, and B, so grateful for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Sarah.
And before I let you go, I have one, maybe more personal question that I've been asking all of my guests since we actually began recording this podcast during quarantine.
Sure.
And that is, what are you most looking forward to doing when we start emerging and heading back towards normal?
Oh my God. I am such an extrovert. So I am struggling right now, not being able to be near and seeking energy with people. So I would say two things. The first is to hug my friends and family. I miss them so much, and I miss that closeness of being with them. I miss my grandma, who's amazing and 91 and killing it in Florida, but I really miss her. So I just want to see her. But the second thing I would say is I'm just going to be excited to go to a restaurant. I think I miss that New York City-ness of being able to just experience the world, explore the world through cuisine and really just enjoy that. And I really look forward to sitting down and having a really nice plate of spaghetti at a really good Upper West Side restaurant. That's what I'm most excited about. Friends and family first, of course, but then I really am excited about a plate of spaghetti. So that's what I'm most looking forward to.
Oh my gosh. I'm quarantined in Cleveland, Ohio, and I would say that going to a restaurant in New York City would be very high up on my list of answers to this question.
You can join me. We would love to have you.
All right, you heard it here first, folks. As soon as quarantine is over, Dana and Sara are going out for pasta.
Amen. Put it on the calendar.
All right, Dana, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Sarah. It was my pleasure. My pleasure. Wishing you health and safety and inspiration in these challenging times.
Right back at you.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Leaderfolk is all about elevating voices and starting conversations, so now we'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@tcjewfolk.com to share your thoughts, your ideas, or to nominate future guests. Leaderfolk is a project of Jewfolk Inc. and the Jewfolk Podcast Network. For more information, visit tcjewfolk.com/podcast.